exactly. Facebook Live, yeah.
Okay, now did that already start?
So, exactly. All
Okay.
right, so hello everyone. So today, me and my colleague Lee Chazen from Glidercell, we are going to speak about Ukraine, the war, what's happening at the moment, and also what can be done, so to say.
All right, Vladan. So I have come prepared with several questions for you, which you've not seen in advance and you are not prepared for. But I'm asking you in particular because you were born in Bosnia, during the Bosnian, or you lived in Bosnia during the Bosnian War. Your family's heritage is East European. You're very familiar with Ukraine and Russia. You've studied European political history and European military history. So I thought you would be an excellent person to ask about what's going on in Ukraine so that we can maybe clear some things up for a lot of people. So my first question is, Vladimir Putin has implied or outright said there is no Ukrainian nation, there is no Ukrainian sovereignty. Can you clear that up? Is he trying to say that there is no Ukrainian people? They have no right to a nation? What do you think the message is?
Well, so thank you very much for the introduction. We just before we started our call, we live streaming, we were discussing about, we had like a personal discussion, and we were discussing that one thing that all humans have in common is that none of us, as for example, Yuval Harari is saying, none of us has or is consisting of a single story, of a single identity. We all have different stories. We have different, let's say, narratives that we believe in, that we are kind of, consisting of, and we can use them differently in different situations. So this means, for example, that you can be Ukrainian and a fascist, and you can be a Ukrainian and a world citizen, or you can also be a Russian and a fascist, or you can be a Russian and a world citizen. Now, since identities are, I usually say identifications are mainly, let's say, politically, socially, culturally constructed, and we as humans believe in them, this is why we often are very, let's say, prone to believing in more or less, mythology, myths, narratives, and even stories that are, simply false. And in the case of what's happening now in Ukraine, it's actually something similar that was happening in the sphere of former Yugoslavia 30 years ago. So one system is now collapsing, and now people are searching for new narratives, new ideas, new system to create, and then they are, now feeling attached to these new stories. And this is why a politician as Putin can even make such comments that, that Ukrainians are Russians, because in this kind of a very, let's say, nationalist, especially if you now speak about ethno-nationalist, or even like this kind of imperial nationalist way of thinking, the message is that, kind of the Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, because it's connected to politics. The idea is that, how to say, or let's say it used to be before the war, the idea that, kind of Ukraine should be either like a part of Russia, or be, let's say, more integrated to Russia, or kind of subordinated. And now imagine, let's say, that you are just, imagine yourself that you are a Russian, you can be a male or a female, doesn't matter. You're sitting somewhere, maybe it can be a big city, it can be a small town, and you're listening to President Putin. And then, you have your everyday life. You have your Monday to Friday job, and then you're in the front of the TV or the internet. And then your president tells you that, we and the Ukrainians are the same people. And then, your brain captures this and sends you a positive, positive feeling. And then you believe in that. You start believing that this is really, this is the case. And this is why I would say these narratives can be so dangerous, because in one way, these narratives, let's say, we and, Russians or we and Ukrainians are the same people. They can be very, how to say, banal. They can be very, how to say, absurd in one way. And at the same time, combined with other factors, with other, in a certain situations, they can be deadly. And it's for example, similar thing. If you look now on the, let's say, the history of former Yugoslavia, because, for example, in the Serb nationalism, there was these ideas that, how to say, that we Serbs and they Bosniaks, or let's say the Bosnian Muslims, are actually the same people, but they kind of accepted Islam, and that was a mistake. They should actually be Serbs. They should be more, they should be us, so to say. And these narratives can be very absurd in everyday life. They don't really make some difference, but they can also be deadly, as it happened in the 90s, and now also what we are seeing, what's happening in Ukraine.
Okay, now, because you grew up in Bosnia, and you're now living in Sweden, but you're currently on a project you're doing in India, so you're more of, say, a world citizen, or you like to think of yourself in that way, I guess. But we're on the topic of identities. Is there a kind of a Slavic identity in general, that you're East European, or that they are, I mean, you've got the Cyrillic alphabet maybe in common between many of these nations and peoples, but is there any, there wasn't kind of a natural way to hold the Soviet Union together. There was all of these different ethnicities and dialects being spoken in languages, and there was a lot of disunity. But they were brought together under this belief that they were under this ideology. Yeah. So is there any of that left? Or does everyone want, what is the mood, I guess I'm asking, in Russia today, in East Europe today about this?
So this is a very interesting thing, because what's happening now in Ukraine is also showing why certain thinkers like Samuel Huntington were actually completely wrong. The thinkers usually on the political, like far right or collectivist right, who believe that humans are belonging to different civilizations, that we are civilizationally divided. And this is how they think. The perception is that, let's say you have a Slavic civilization, so now it means that everyone who is Slavic, everyone, I don't know, from a Russian to Bulgarian to Polish and to Ukrainians, they should not fight against each other, because according to this myth, they're part of the same civilization. But one of the reasons why civilizationism as an idea is not reflecting the reality, the global reality, is simply because humans are mainly divided for political reasons. So let's say, for example, most of the people in Ukraine are, you have the, let's say, different Orthodox churches. You have Orthodox Christianity, and also in Russia, you have Orthodox Christianity. And Ukrainians are, both in Russians and Ukrainians are categorized as Eastern Slavs. And they are, the countries, the governments now are in the war. And the same thing with the Balkans, if you now speak about former Yugoslavia. So both, let's say, Serbs and Croats are considered to be South Slavs. But during the 90s, Serbia and Croatia were fighting against each other. So, having a same language or similar language or same religion, same, let's say, this kind of a larger cultural identification doesn't mean that you have same political identification, doesn't mean that you have the same political ambitions. Because, for example, if you take, let's say, in Bosnia, so the majority, so if you now look at the support for Bosnia joining the European Union, the support is actually as strongest among the Bosnian Muslim community. So the Bosnian Muslims in general are, let's say, they are also Slavic in the sense, in the language. And at the same time, the main opposition against Bosnia joining the EU is actually among the Bosnian Serbs that also are Slavic, speak the same language. And this is not a civilizational difference. This is not a cultural difference. This is a political difference. And for example, let's say both Romania and Bulgaria are, sorry, let's say Bulgaria is part of the EU despite having this kind of a, Slavic cultural layer. And Croatia and Slovenia are part of the EU at the same time as they're categorized as the South Slavic countries, if you now speak in terms of the languages for the most. And this is something it's very important to understand. If you now, let's say, if you now speak more about, let's say, if you now try to compare it a little bit with America. So the thing that, for example, most people in South America are Catholics is still not kind of preventing, certain conflicts that are based more on politics. If you now look on, for example, let's say Venezuela or Cuba, or what's happening in Brazil and so on. And this is why it's important to understand that the divisions or conflicts or even, let's say, wars between people are usually mainly about politics. Even what you call ethnic violence or ethnic wars are actually about, it means that a certain ethnic identity is politicized. It's about politicization of ethnicity. It's not that ethnicity itself creates conflict only because there is a certain ethnicity.
Right. It's done more to consolidate power, to have a base of power. So it's the whole divide and conquer idea that you bring people together by the opposition. And so you create this narrative that's really ugly about the opposition to consolidate your base, which is a lot of what's happening right now. But bringing this back for a second to Ukraine specifically, and tell me if I'm right about this, but I believe 17% of Ukraine, approximately 8 million, and we're talking about in a country of what, about 40 million people, same as the population of California where I am right now. And 17% are ethnically Russian or identify as being Russian. And do you think these people within Ukraine maybe want to be liberated? They want to be a part of Russia. They feel that they're trapped in the wrong country somehow.
So one of the biggest mistakes, and I remember this from my personal experience, because I was involved in politics and at that time, like in party politics, which I'm not at the moment. So one of the biggest mistakes, let's say, before the war started against Ukraine, 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and so on, and Lugansk, Donetsk region, was the belief, this is very much in common in Europe and America, among many policymakers, politicians, experts, that Ukraine is divided in the middle. So you have the western part, the eastern part. The western part is pro-Europe, pro-NATO, pro-West. The eastern part is the opposite, pro-Russia and so on. But the reality was much, much, much more complicated, much, much more different. And I remember this when I was in Kiev, like only 3 years ago. And I like to talk to Uber and taxi drivers because they are reading newspapers. They're like, intelligence officers in every city. They know what's happening. When they are not working, they are reading papers and, reading media. And they know the streets, they know people and so on. And I remember, like, most of the drivers in Kiev, which is a big city, supposed to be pro-Ukrainian, were, for the country, for the nation and against Russia and for Europe and so on. But I would also meet drivers who were kind of more skeptical, and they would say that, they have some, pro-Russian sympathies, but they accept, they are Ukrainian citizens as well. And the thing is, what happened that this West-East divide was simply a myth. And even in the eastern part of Ukraine, even in, let's say, Lugansk and Donetsk region, these occupied territories, according to certain estimates, and I've been reading studies, for example, by, I think it's called Ilko Kucherev Democracy Initiative Institute, based in Kiev. So according to certain estimates, like around 30 to 40% of people living in these areas, they still see themselves as Ukrainians, let's say in the first hand. They see themselves really as Ukrainian citizens. And so it means that even people in Lugansk and Donetsk regions are having these political conflicts with each other. What should happen? What should be the future of Ukraine? And so the reality is much, much more complicated. And for example, it was a little bit like the same thing in ex-Yugoslavia. So for example, let's say during the first elections in Croatia, like, before the war, first democratic elections. So many Serbs that were living in larger cities would not vote for the Serb nationalist parties. They would vote for more civic parties like social democrats or social liberals, simply because they didn't, this kind of nationalist rhetoric was not appealing to them. They were living together with Croats, and they wanted to have, to have a common future. And the same thing, like, for example, in Bosnia, one of the reasons why Bosnia was even able to have a referendum for, let's say, independence from Yugoslavia in 1992 was because many Serbs that were pro-Bosnia actually, voted for that. And this is why kind of people are, at the end of the day, more politically divided than they are, let's say, culturally or socially, so to say.
Right. So I'm wondering if it is this confusing for most. I mean, we'll get to Western Europe in a second, but right now I want to focus on Eastern Europe and people who maybe ethnically identify with their Slavic brothers and sisters. I don't even know how to put this correctly, but without stepping on toes and upsetting people. But is there, would you think, solidarity between a lot of the Eastern European countries with Ukraine, or do they feel, is there a longing? I think I told you about this meeting I had with several people in San Jose. One was Lithuanian, one was Ukrainian, and they were both, one was wearing a Putin t-shirt, and they were wishing for they wanted to drink to the former Soviet Union. And, I had learned in some of my political science classes too, that even going back to the 1980s, there was this kind of nostalgia for Stalin, even, which was surprising to me because of how horrific he was to his own people. 10 million of his own people died at his hands. 20 million died, during World War II, which makes me wonder, how can you be nostalgic for that era? So do you think that exists? Are they not talking? Because you don't hear about this in the news right now. But is there this longing for, let's bring back the Soviet Union?
Yes, I mean, there is that kind of nostalgia, as I call it, nostalgia politics, or politics of nostalgia. And we have to understand that nostalgia is part of our human psychology. We all have it. Sooner or later in life, we all start feeling nostalgic. Every human on the planet has some kind of a nostalgia at some point in its life. And the thing is that when nostalgia becomes politics, you cannot really, it's very hard to be, let's say, for freedom and individualism, and at the same time be for, politics of nostalgia. This is why politics of nostalgia ends up being in favor of, authoritarianism, of collectivism, of, we need a system, we need this, the strong man, the system. And the same thing, what I've seen, I would say there's a similar behavior when it comes to what's called Yugo-nostalgia. So Yugo-nostalgia is like nostalgia for Yugoslavia, and with the Soviet nostalgia. So it's kind of a similar behavior that, it's not only about older people. This politics of nostalgia, it can even, let's say, it can, be transferred, or I would say even it can, a little bit like almost like a disease. It can affect younger people. So younger people, like, can be told that by their, grandparents or their parents, oh, I used to have a salary every month, and our nation was great, and we were winning in football and basketball, golden medals, and we had a large army, we had the biggest army in Europe, and, that kind of stuff. And then they can feel inspired by this. And then they're also becoming authoritarians and collectivists, even if they're young, even if they never lived in that kind of age. And this is the interesting thing, is that even in Sweden, you will find, because I'm living in Stockholm, you will find this politics of nostalgia of today. It's also about kind of, Sweden was so equal in the 1970s, and we had a great economy, and the welfare state was like, super nice. So it's very, how to say, it's very fascinating in one way how this can happen. Now, so this nostalgia for the Soviet Union is still existing in certain parts of Europe. And this is partly by, for example, how to say, if you now have a look on Hungary, because you were asking about Eastern European countries. So there is a different level of support or different behaviors between different EU governments. So for example, the Hungarian government, which is under the rule of Viktor Orban, who is labeled as a far-right, nationalist, right-wing populist politician, for example, many of his voters also have this kind of nostalgia for, well, it's not that like they like communism. Communism is bad because it was a wrong type of collectivism. It was a wrong type of authoritarianism. But they have this kind of nostalgia for, like, how things were more in the society, how it was with the family. You didn't have any feminists, you didn't have any gay people, you didn't have any refugees, that kind of stuff. And this is what they can admire, this kind of feeling that things used to be better. And this is why politics of nostalgia, and it can really result in horrible behaviors if we speak about how institutions are being used as they are being used now at the moment in Europe.
Well, I imagine it can be very empowering on the individual level. That and by the way, having been in Warsaw and seen the architecture there, when I was there, I was told that the architecture was purposely imposing. It was Soviet built by this or designed by the Soviet Union, by Soviet architects. And it was made to feel so that the individual would feel small, and you did feel small. It was not done, you didn't feel inspired. I'm talking about Warsaw, not Krakow. There's a big, or Krakow, depending on your pronunciation.
True. Yeah.
And so, my point is that on an individual level, maybe you're empowered because your life isn't personally that great. You're not doing that great. But when somebody talks about bringing back the greatness of your nation, that can make you feel that you're part of something big. And so I wonder if there's a little bit of that narrative coming out of Putin right now, that because Ukraine was an important, essential part of the Soviet Union, being, I think you mentioned this the other night, the breadbasket, right?
Yes.
The great, it's a great exporter of wheat. And the Stalinist collectivization program was mainly taking place in Ukraine, if I understand that correctly. So there's probably some nostalgia for that, I'm sure. Or would you disagree?
No, I really don't disagree. I mean, so here are some couple of things. So there is research showing that, we as humans are affected by our local environment, including by architecture, that basically we create our social world based on our values, and like even the architecture can reflect, which kind of values are dominating in the society, or are more, let's say, represented in the society. And you were mentioning like this, that, so basically if you put, let's say, people in a house, without windows, and it's very dirty, and you keep them, let's say, for like 4 weeks, and then you let them out and they are very hateful, they can, they basically feel, how to say, very authoritarian, very, very hateful towards others. And you were speaking about this kind of, that the people should feel small or like little. And this is also partly why certain ideas like nationalism even work, because even if you have many personal problems in life, even if you feel that you are not really making a success of your career, or you have many problems, or I don't know, your girlfriend left you or your boyfriend left you, but you can still have this feeling that you're part of something bigger, you're part of a nation or something like that. And this gives you a certain satisfaction. This gives you a certain sense of belonging. And in the case of Russia, one of the reasons why Putin even came to power was because he basically told people like, give me your votes, give me your let's say support, and I will bring order. I will make Russia great again. I will fix, a little bit like Trump. I will fix things. I will give you the sense of pride and so on.
Well, in his case, when he says I alone can do this, he actually has that authority. Whereas in the United States, you don't have that authority.
Yeah.
There are a system of checks and balances here, which are all but gone now in Russia.
Yeah, exactly, because Russia is a dictatorship after all. And the important thing here is to understand that the Putin is not alone. You have the deep state, you have the network state, you have different, let's say, circles, different groups. Like you have the former KGB, which is now the FSB, the Secret Service. So you have like the whole network of people that are behind Putin. So Putin is more like a symbol, for the common, let's say, person in Russia. But you have, if you read certain analysis, if you read research, and you realize that, whoa, it's much more complex. That you have different groups in a society who are basically controlling the state apparatus, the administration. And the thing with Ukraine is that it was not only the breadbasket for the Soviet Union, but it was also like 1/3 of the military industrial complex. So Dnipro, what used to be called Dnipropetrovsk, was basically the whole city was almost just producing weapons and military systems. Kharkiv, where now fightings are taking place, that's the tank city. That was one of the tank cities where these tanks like T-64, T-55, 72 were produced. And now what Putin has been doing, and not only Putin but other Russian more or less nationalist politicians, what they've been doing already, basically since the end of 1990s, early 2000s, is creating these narratives, this mythology that Ukraine and Russia is one country, or should be one country. We're the same people. It's the similar thing if you look on, let's say, Serbia even today, with like these narratives about we and Montenegro are one country, or one nation.
Well, how would you relate that to the United States? Because this brings up an important comparison that I'm sure maybe people are talking about, but we are 50 states and I don't know, several territories.
Yeah.
Here in the United States, 50 states. And there are some huge differences between someone from New York, someone from Texas, someone from Florida, someone from Washington State. There are big differences, not to mention, people in Colorado, Kansas, etc. Very big differences. And there's rivalries, not only between the states, but within those states.
Yeah.
So is this the same as if, let's say, California was going to war against Texas?
Well, it's more it's more like this. Now, I was actually thinking before our call what I should compare it with.
Well, actually, let me clear that up, though. That's a bad comparison, because it would be a large state against a smaller entity.
Well, partly like that, but I think there is even a better comparison. For example, I was thinking about, Texas and the Alamo, because at that time, Texas was not part of the American Confederation. This is before of the Civil War. It was not part of the United States of America before it even became a more, let's say, unified nation, a federation, basically. And then you had people like, Davy Crockett and company, like cheering, we need to support Texas. They are also fellow Americans. And that's a little bit similar case with Europe, that in the European Union, there are many people, including myself, that say that, Ukrainians in general want to be Europeans. They want to, be part of the union. Let's provide them support. They want to be part of our democracy. They want to have the same citizenship as we have, as in, from Stockholm to Rome, from, let's say, Warsaw to Lisbon, and to have the same laws, same governance. So let's support them. And that was the case, with Texas, with what was the name, Sam Houston and others, that they wanted basically Texas to become part of America. And at the beginning, there was even not enough support among contemporary Americans. Some were like, but do we really want them, to become part of our union? I mean, maybe it's better they still belong to Mexico. So
well, don't get me started on American politics, because things will disintegrate very quickly. So I don't even want to talk about that. And I also don't want to talk about whether or not you think that Trump is an operative of Putin somehow. I don't want to get into that, because that starts getting into all kinds of conspiracies, and we're taking shots in the dark. So I just want to stay clear of anything like that. But I did have this weird hypothetical that I just thought of as you were talking about Texas, that sometimes history has, well, I don't know if this is in the code of history, the algorithm of history, but is there, I'm just trying to put something hopeful out there. Could this dramatically backfire for Putin in such a way? Because Zelensky has made some very powerful speeches recently. They're very effective, and Putin maybe wasn't counting on that. And when they learn of his kind of pro-democracy and the fact that he's Jewish, a Jewish leader of a nation of that size, something that could probably never happen in Russia, I'm guessing, could never happen there. Does that pose a threat? I mean, could Russians see this and think, wait a minute, I think we're with Ukraine. Maybe we want to be a part of that nation.
Well, so I will try to explain this on a very high level and a very low level. So let's start with the low level. On a low level, what's happening now globally is that many people around the world, and even let's say here in India where I'm at the moment, or in South America when I'm reading on Twitter, what they see is a big nation, attacking a smaller one. What they see is a nation with much larger military attacking another one with a smaller military, and they simply feel sympathetic for Ukraine, because maybe in a similar way as if you would be now on the street and you see a bigger guy attacking a smaller guy. It's kind of very psychological like that. We usually as humans, we take the side of the smaller person because we feel that it's injustice, that is not fair, So that's like on a very low level. On a high, yeah.
No, I was just going to interrupt you really quickly. When you hear stories about Ukrainian citizens taking freeway signs down so that the Russians don't know how to navigate, to Kiev or to Kyiv or to other cities, or when you hear about men trying to get back to Ukraine before they have their 60th birthday because they want to make sure that they can be in their military, or when you see refugees leaving and they're not knowing where their husbands are and if they're going to survive the war. Those are all very powerful stories that do not work well for Putin.
No, they do. No, exactly, because this is something people can relate to, and you don't have to have a history of living in a war during wartime to be to feel sympathy for people in Ukraine. You can just be somewhere on your street, like in Bogota or in New York or in Chennai or in Tokyo, and you can just you can just relate to this from your own local environment and think what Russia is doing, what the Russian government is doing is horrible. And what these people are doing is it's how to say, something you are sympathetic to, something you would do yourself if you were in a similar or the same situation. And if I now go on the more, let's say, meta level, on a high level, so what we are witnessing now, when I say we, like me, you, and many others, billions of others around the world, is it's actually, I would say, a new 9/11 moment. It's something that's gonna change institutions, policies, behaviors, development across the world. For example, what I see now in Sweden, where many people still believe that we are neutral, not realizing that we joined the European Union in 1995, is that I would say if there was a referendum today on NATO, if Sweden should join NATO because Sweden is not in NATO, is that most people would simply say, yes, let's join the NATO. And that more people now in Europe are going to support Ukraine, that be against Russia. Russia, is going to lose much of its credibility among, many other nations around the world that even are usually against the United States and, not always sympathetic to European Union for different reasons, even for valid reasons. And what I also think could happen is that if you speak about backfiring, so we have to realize that Russia itself, it's a multi-ethnic society, that a large part of the Russian population are not ethnic Russians, they are something else. They are like Tatars, like in Tatarstan, or Chechens, or Buryats, like in Buryatia and so on. And the case was during the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, that many people, for example, in the Russian state of Tatarstan, felt that, if Russia is now recognizing these occupied territories like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that basically are still part of Georgia, why shouldn't we, become independent from Russia? So you have ethnic separatism in Russia as well at the moment. And this ethnic separatism, which I find it's horrible itself, because it's going to lead to many bad things. Like, it's not going to be about democracy and human rights. It's going to be more about primitive behaviors. Like it's going to be very aggressive. This could happen in Russia, because we have one thing to remember if we speak about Europe is that, for example, Tatarstan government, they actually tried to open an office in Brussels already, I think, in 1992, 93. So as Russia was having these internal problems with Yeltsin and the military coup attempt in Moscow, and shootings in the at the parliament building. So it's important to realize that ethnic separatism for Russia is a double-edged sword. It can work for them now, as it's working in Eastern Ukraine and Georgia, but it can also work against them, as in, let's say, for example, as in Tatarstan.
Right, which is to say nothing of like the people in Vladivostok, for example, 12 time zones potentially, right, away from Moscow. Mm. And, talk about feeling disconnected, or the people in Kazakhstan or any of the former republics, they're so remote. I remember hearing, in my political science classes going back to, to the 1980s, we had a defense intelligence speaker in one of my classes, and I think I told you about this, and he said, everything you're hearing about the Soviet Union, you shouldn't believe. He said, there are so many ethnicities not wanting to be a part of this. It's not natural for them to be in the Soviet Union. And so he said it was, and this is in 1984, saying that they were going to start dissolving and start breaking away, even then. And that was 6 years before it actually happened. So who knows where this could lead? Do you have any, but getting to the war itself, we've talked about the history and the different ethnicities and some of the culture and background, but getting to the war itself, because I know you studied military history. How do you think this will play out tactically, strategically on the ground? Where do you think this is going to go? Because as we're speaking right now, Kyiv could be falling today or in the next day or two.
I have to say, like, partly because I'm too emotional at the moment, I don't want to, I cannot really give you a good answer, good analysis, because I'm following the situation every day, as on Twitter or on Telegram. Telegram is a wonderful device here because I follow both Ukrainian and Russian sources. And the thing is that, things can change dramatically this weekend, today. They can change tomorrow. They can change next week. It's very hard to say. I would say like this, that I think that Russia is using, I think, around 200,000 something troops in Ukraine. And I think it's simply not enough to occupy Ukraine in general, to really kind of put Ukraine under its control, simply because there is enough Ukrainian, so there is enough number of Ukrainians who are resisting, not only soldiers or, let's say, National Guard, but even more like more or less armed civilians who are just taking up Molotov cocktails and whatever they can have, from home, and to use it against the Russian troops. And this kind of blitzkrieg, I don't think it's gonna work out for Russia, simply because the Ukrainian resistance is simply it's organized and it's prepared, and it's simply too much for the Russian armed forces at the moment. I mean, Russia has a bigger army, of course, but they still have to have troops in Siberia. They still have to have troops in Caucasus. They have to keep the parts of Caucasus under control. You need to keep your own population under control. So basically they cannot just send everyone to Ukraine. So that's the thing. And from right now, what I can see, you can say that technically Ukraine is winning because they are not becoming occupied. I mean, the Kiev is still in the hands of the Ukrainian government, and the Russian, let's say, military is not basically not achieving its objectives.
Well, it depends, because we don't know exactly what those objectives are. They may be trying to just secure, portions of the population or small pieces of territory. We don't know exactly, or we're not being told. But you also have to think that even though formally, I should say, we don't talk about NATO, any type of an invasion or putting up a, European and American combined resistance. But you have to think that behind the scenes, there could be operatives, there could be intelligence officers from any number of European countries, including the United States. We just don't know who could be doing some things. There's also, the information wars, the cyber wars that are going on. Yeah. We are waging an information war. There's a war to control the narrative right now. And I would say that's not looking very good for Putin either. He's losing that battle.
He's completely losing that battle. Like, let's say the media war, definitely. As we mentioned earlier, like people around the world, they simply feel more sympathetic to Ukraine and Ukrainians when they see what's happening. And I would say, like, what I personally would like to see at the moment, I would like to see something called Uniting for Peace. Uniting for Peace is a principle in the United Nations when enough member states think that the Security Council is not doing its job, which is very often not the case, So they can unite for peace by overriding the Security Council and provide a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. I think this would be the optimal solution for several reasons, because it would mean that the war stops. UN peacekeepers enter, for example, both Kiev and the eastern parts, and they belong to different member states that have, let's say, relations with both America, EU, and Russia. And this means that Russia has to withdraw its troops, and that Russians cannot say that the UN force, it's, let's say, Western, because the UN force will have personnel from South America, maybe even, from, let's say, from Africa, from Ethiopia. Well, it's not Ethiopia, maybe some other place, sorry. It will have troops, let's say, from India, from the global South, Bangladesh, and so on. This could be a real solution.
Procedurally, how does this happen again? Because there was a veto in the Security Council. And I thought it was interesting also that China abstained.
And India abstained, yeah.
And India abstained too. Okay. Yeah. But that means that there were going to be no United Nations, there would not be a United Nations joint resolution condemning Russia. But how are you saying procedurally, because I didn't understand that part, how do they overturn this? Is it similar to like a 2/3 override in the Congress?
Well, similar, yeah. It's called Uniting for Peace. I don't remember now. My memory is a little bit short when this was used the last time. But for example, if you remember Kofi Annan, so one of my idols, let's say like that, I have his posters at home. Kofi Annan, during the Kosovo War, so Russia and China vetoed that the NATO would intervene against, at that time, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia under Milosevic, Milosevic, Serbia. So Kofi Annan, after that, Kofi Annan said it was illegal to intervene against Milosevic's government, to intervene against Serbia, but it was necessary. And it was this, I would say, the same case here. It would be illegal to intervene against Russia and Ukraine by providing peacekeepers to the country, but it's necessary. It's simply necessary. Otherwise, that would be the way to stop the war tomorrow, so to say.
Right, because this could be the largest mass exodus or migration of peoples in Europe if the war continues since World War II, I'm guessing. Nobody wants to see this escalate. And so, we're hoping that cooler heads prevail here. So now, because you're in India, I have to ask you this because we have to include this in our conversation or it would just not make sense. You're in New Delhi?
Yes.
Okay. And we don't have to talk about, your work there, but you were at the Ukrainian embassy yesterday, right?
Yes.
And can you tell people what you saw?
Well, when I came there, there was several media, like India Today, for example, one of the larger channels here in India. There were like a lot of flowers, being placed outside of the embassy and posters about Ukraine. I was not able to find any flower shops. I just went to a nearby park and I picked up some small flowers, not like bigger ones. I didn't want to destroy, the park. So I put them there at the embassy. And there were visits being made. There was the EU envoy. So the EU has its own, let's say, like ambassador to India. There was the Lithuanian ambassador, and I actually didn't know that he was the ambassador of Lithuania because Lithuania's interest in one of the smallest EU nations, but it has a bad history regarding Russia and the Soviet Union. It was partly occupied, 2 times during the Second World War by the Soviet Union and enforced into the Soviet Union, and yeah, so people were coming there, even some like younger people, students, coming to express support for Ukrainian community, Ukrainian population. And the Ukrainian ambassador was hugging the Lithuanian ambassador to India, and it was very emotional, so to say. Right. And funny thing, the Venezuelan embassy is just across the street. So Ukrainian embassy and Venezuelan embassy, they see each other, from their windows. It felt so absurd because, as the Venezuela government is supporting Russia and even recognizing these occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. And they are like neighbors here in Delhi.
Wow, that is fascinating. I mean, I do have a story to tell about being in the Russian embassy, but I don't want to share that. It was, it felt very unreal. It was part of this mission right after college of Silicon Valley executives trying to have trading relations with Moscow at the time. And I'll just say that I went through the list of people we were in contact with, and one of the American embassy people who we were in contact with at the time died in a mysterious car accident in Moscow. And so that should be a reminder, though, of of what we're dealing with. That they're not playing by the rule book that the West understands anyway, which is to have negotiations, to have some to reach out and have some diplomacy. And at this point, we don't. I don't know. There are no talks in sight. Was there anything more you wanted to say though about India?
Well, the interesting thing is that here in India, there are also kind of different behaviors. So let's say historically seen, India is supporting, Russia because it has to do, with the, how to say it, so that when India became, let's say, sovereign from, United Kingdom, Prime Minister Nehru was at that time seeking inspiration in the Soviet Union. Not that we believed in dictatorship or communism, but he wanted industrialization. He wanted to industrialize India, and he was more in favor of that model. And there is there are these kind of historical connections between Russia and India. Now, what's happening in India is very kind of fascinating because the Indian government, despite that, how to say, Prime Minister Modi, well, basically he has a lot of similarities put in his political views, in his policies. So instead of, let's say, supporting Russia, and instead of voting against it, they just abstained, because in this way they are not supporting the Russian government, but they are neither kind of completely, how to say, making, they're not completely kind of isolating themselves from the Russian government. And this is why Russia is now, I would say, as a government, a little bit confused, because they were expecting China and India to support them on this. And now even in India, like, you'll find many people who very feel sympathetic towards Ukraine, despite that they know, usually most of Indians, they usually know something about Russia, but they don't know always of something, or in most cases about Ukraine, because Ukraine is much smaller. And, let's say an ordinary Indian citizen can relate more to Russia because, Russia is big, and, we are big, and, and so on. So, but now there is even some more sympathy towards Ukraine, because when people look on television, what's happening, so to say.
Yeah. So there's so much to say, and I don't know how to summarize, the major points that we've covered, other than I think we're going to need to do a 2.0 version of this conversation as things progress, and see if any of the things we talked about came to fruition. I don't even want to, make any kind of predictions at this point. I mean, I'm hopeful that there'll be some great solidarity. I'm hopeful that the sanctions, will work. They're debating now whether to do this full kind of swift, a ban, so that Russia can't. I mean, because if they don't have access to the banking messaging system, then think about all their oil and gas exports and all the money that needs to be exchanged between different countries, and that comes to a close. They would have to find different ways. I mean, I don't know if they can use PayPal or Venmo or cryptocurrency, at that level of government. I don't know how that works. I know SWIFT doesn't have control over crypto. So maybe that's something that will happen, is they'll just go underground. I really don't know how that's going to work and what effect that'll have. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the thing is, to be honest, is that I don't think I'm in favor of, at the moment, kicking out Russia from SWIFT, but I don't think it's a silver bullet as many people believe, because you have to understand the Russian economy, Russia is kind of already prepared its economy for the war, for this situation. And also that I have to say this, the sad thing is that the nationalism is such a powerful idea that many people will accept being poor and being economically devastated as long as you have this feeling of belonging and greatness. This is the thing. So many Russians will simply accept that they are now getting worse economy, but we are defending ourselves against NATO and American imperialism.
Yeah, well, that's if it's a great patriotic war. For example, we had our victory gardens here in the United States during World War II, where but seriously, and we would have people buy bonds, by government, treasury bonds, to raise money. And we were able to get Hollywood involved to produce movies, to get people excited about the war.
Yeah, John Wayne.
And yeah, I know. There's a lot of ways to mobilize a population. I just don't know if Putin has any of those types of things at his disposal. I don't know what the propaganda campaign looks like. My guess is that this will just turn into some advanced form of cyber war and we'll never know what's really going on. I'm sure there's, I think I told you once about this NSA contractor who was on a hike with a group of people in Silicon Valley, and he was telling us about all the cyber attacks that were going on prior to 2016, and he was very concerned about what would happen during the election and the Russian cyber attacks. That was the first time I had learned just how much is going on there. That's not the type of thing that gets covered in broadcast news typically. They don't have access to that sort of information. We don't know what's going on. We'll definitely know if there's an attack on our power grid, or on the banking system, if that gets hacked.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we don't know. I mean, they have capabilities in their area that rival anything that we can do.
And that's also part of the problem. If you now speak about, history repeating itself, or let's say if you better say like, human stupidity repeating itself, is that governments around the world have invested a large amount of money in weapons, in military, in cyber warfare. So, you're investing money, you are basically using people's energy. You are consuming things for this kind of stuff. The idea is that, we are using money, energy, our intellectual capabilities to basically destroy each other. A little bit like, let's say Japan, before attacking Pearl Harbor, like invest for 20 years almost, where it was investing money, educating people, brainwashing people to, kind of putting all of the energy, science, technology, military, just, for imperial expansion. And it's the same thing with both Russian and American governments. And this is why I usually say that it's really important here to make a difference between governments and society. This is why I can also be, let's say, critical towards the Ukrainian government as I am towards the Russian government, but I still support the Ukrainian society because I think it's much better than the Russian one for several reasons, like democracy, media pluralism, openness. And I also like the American society much more than I would ever gonna like Russian society, at least at the moment. And I would really encourage like people in America to, despite all of the, let's say, political tribalism, political divisions, like really try to support your America as a society. Like, you can be critical against both the Democratic and Republican Party. You can be critical against Washington, against the federal government, but, be prepared to support your society and your local communities, because you have your everyday life at the end of the day, and after all, you can always try to create a better society, even if your governments are simply horrible. So
right. Well, we don't get arrested when we have a protest march or when we hold up a sign, and you'll see this all around. I'm living in the capital city of California, Sacramento, and so you'll see a lot of political protests here. So we take a lot of these things for granted, and they are amazing. I don't know to what extent free speech gets shut down on social media in Russia, but I mean, you've seen on Facebook and all the other social networks and Twitter especially what you can do. But I will tell you one quick story about this woman I knew from Iran.
Yeah.
And I asked her, I think, if she was on Twitter, and she said, no, I'm not on Twitter, and my friends aren't on Twitter. And the reason I'm not on Twitter is because my friends have disappeared because of what they said on Twitter. And this was in Iran, and this was about 5-6 years ago. And so in many places in the world, you are not free to speak openly about your opinions, about your leader, about your government.
I remember this from my childhood. So so here's the thing, for example. So my father, so basically, who kind of became my first inspiration regarding, politics and society and ideas. So he's from a, let's say, from a kind of an anarcho left political background. He's more of a progressive person. And he tried to explain to people in his own family, to his own parents, both during Yugoslavia and after Yugoslavia, after the war, he tried to explain to them that, state and society are not the same thing. And that the difference between, let's say, the Soviet Union and America, and later on, let's say, between kind of Russia and America, is that, I can go to, in America, I could go to, I can go to a Neil Young concert, but I cannot do that in the Soviet Union. That was the main thing for him. I can be critical, I can be negative towards the American government, to the Soviet government, but the difference is that I can go and listen to, let's say, Frank Zappa concert, but I cannot listen to Frank Zappa in the Soviet Union. So this is the thing.
Didn't he become a hero of, I forget which Eastern European country wanted him to become president? Do you remember? You'll have to see the documentary about him. Yeah. But he was incredibly popular. Oh yeah, he was very counterculture, and absolutely spoke his mind freely for as long as he was alive, which was great. So we should take a moment and appreciate all the various freedoms that we have. When we have conversations like this, we shouldn't take it for granted. And I'm hoping that the European nations come together convincingly to pull Ukraine into that into that culture, into that belief system, because I think now that they've seen it. I mean, because originally the whole totalitarian idea was we don't want them to see what's on the other side. I mean, it literally was the wall in Berlin, because if they saw it and realized what they could do, there would be no reason to stay here. And then you have to remind people also, how much immigration is there to Russia, where they immigrate to live and thrive, versus how much immigration is there to European countries and the United States? I mean, I know that sounds so, I don't know, that sounds nostalgic too. I mean, it sounds like I'm being nationalistic by saying that, but it's also true. It's also true, right? I mean, we do represent, I mean, I can't even tell you how many ethnic groups from other countries I saw when I was living in San Jose, in Silicon Valley. Everyone was from somewhere else. Everyone wanted to be here because of the opportunities. My grandfather left, Berdichev in Ukraine because of the opportunities that would happen in the, well, he left because the Cossacks were chasing him across the border too. And he probably would have stayed, had there been greater love and opportunity there. But, he came here. And so did the rest of our family from Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, and all those places.
That's a very good comparison. That's a very good, how to say, way to show the difference between state and society, is that, America is not only like, how we call it, like a salad ball, but it, it's really attracted people through history simply because people around the world, even like, especially as in Europe, realized that, they could have a better life there, that they could live in their communities, religious communities or ethnic communities, and not be submitted to repression, at least not be submitted to government repression. They could still face other types of discrimination, repression, but there's a difference, when you are kind of being repressed, let's say by like other individuals, and when the government is against you, then there's sometimes very big difference. And if you look on Russia, there is immigration to Russia, as from Central Asia, as from Tajikistan, I think maybe Uzbekistan. You have these guest workers, you have people who are cleaning the streets, working in metro, making food, taking these jobs that even many Russians don't want to do. But it's still not the same kind of attractiveness. It's not the same influence as if you compare to United States, so to say, which is still attracting people, especially as from South America.
So I wanted to kind of summarize this with something that I remembered recently from a trip that I made to Auschwitz during a college music tour of Poland. I know I've mentioned this to you before, but I think it's poignant. It's important here. And so we are standing there. Now this is the 1980s. And we're standing there at the railroad tracks at Auschwitz. To me, it's all surreal. It seems like I can't believe I'm here. I've studied this my whole childhood. I've seen the movies, and now I'm standing at this very place where the trains carrying Jews from, and really anyone who was an enemy of Hitler, including Russians, carried them to the camps. And this was the final part of our tour. And the tour guide, this Polish woman, said, the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, but they forgot one thing. And then she paused. They forgot to leave. And I thought I wanted to kind of conclude with that because it makes an important point. Like, you can do something good and stand for something good, and then you can take it too far. That it's not enough to have achieved the victory in World War II, but now you're going to impose this authoritarian control over otherwise free people. And so what have you really won at that point? What have you won? We went back, and through the Marshall Plan, we helped to re-engage Europe economically so that they could thrive, and so that we could all appreciate democratic values. And so the victory actually meant something. And they went and did something much different. And it wasn't even true to their ideology. It was, Gene Kirkpatrick's book, Dictatorships and Double Standards, talked about that it's not communism, it's authoritarianism.
Yeah. Absolutely. I know exactly what you mean because, and now we are kind of going a little bit back to we're kind of finalizing with going back a little bit to the beginning of our discussion, because, you have different stories, you have different ideas, and these stories can also, or ideas, they can merge. So what did the Russian communists like Lenin, what did they basically did as soon as they established the Soviet Union? Well, let's combine it with old Russian kind of nationalism and imperialism and try to expand, try to take over other countries, try to, to increase our sphere of influence. It's not like, we will now first create, let's say, we will now create communism through convincing people, through, spreading the idea. No. We will create it, expand communism through use of military and violence. And
well, it's sad that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead with that point.
Yeah, and the sad thing here is, if you now also speak about ideas, is that one similarity I see between, let's say, the former Soviet Union and former Yugoslavia is that, this narrative like we won against fascists and fascism was more about we won against Germany and Germans. Not that people really understood what fascism is, and as an ideology, as an idea. And this is why many people in Russia don't understand now that what their own government is doing is actually in line with fascism. As an idea that, you have absolute loyalty to your nation, you have absolute loyalty to the great leader, and you accept that other nations should be destroyed only because they are different.
Yeah, I mean, well, this gets into psychology and neuroscience too, because we categorize things for the sake of convenience, for the sake of intellectual laziness, that we can't conceive of nuance and combining philosophies into something new or different. We stick with what we know. We still have this left-right political spectrum. It's not a sphere. It's not three-dimensional. It's not synesthetic, like with sounds and colors and all kinds of things. It's words and text, and this is the left and this is the right, and which team are you on? Are you in a red state or a blue state? What does your party stand for? And what I was going to say before is it's sad because in the same way that communism kind of turned into authoritarianism, it had nothing to do with the original ideas of like sharing and, worker self-management and things like that. It turned into something much, much different. But in that same way, our political parties have turned into win at any cost. It's all about winning and, controlling the narrative. It's not about selling your philosophy, because if you ask most Americans, for example, what is the philosophy of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? What do you believe in? They probably can't tell you so much as, what they've heard on cable news about why they hate the other side. I mean, that's what it's turned into. And so that's no different than what we're seeing in Ukraine. I mean, trying to bring it back full circle. It's nothing different. So listen, I know it's
true. No, but that's the case.
You should
there
be
are many
drinking
lessons
some of your
learned.
coffee.
Yeah.
But I know we've gone on for quite a while now.
Yeah, it's an epic discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, you have your whole day in front of you, and I'm at the end of my Saturday. So we'll come back later and continue this.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you everyone for listening. And we will also, I will put this on YouTube as well sooner or later. So say.
Yeah, and I will talk to you soon, Vladan.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll call you right after we conclude this.
Absolutely.
Just to wrap up a couple of things, okay?
Sure. So, greetings from India then.
All right, and greetings from Sacramento, California.
All right. Ciao.
Good night, everyone,
Thanks.
and good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Ciao.